Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Rosa and Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chavla, and as always, I'm really pleased to be joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunello Rosa. This week, we're talking about macro stability and geopolitical risks, and the key takeaways from the recent Ambrosetti Forum held on the shores of Lake Como. Certainly, there's worse places to have a conference, Brunello. I'm very jealous of the last week that you just spent there, which I'm sure was very, very insightful. But let's tackle some of the key issues here. One of the key things, obviously discussed every year at this forum, is the macroeconomic perspective and where the global economy is heading. What was the pulse of the sort of macro perspective that you got here?
So, yeah, as you correctly say, well, first of all, it is a very nice environment. But, there's also a good gathering of policymakers from all around the world. The April edition is more macro and finance. The summer edition is a bit broader in context. But macro and finance are obviously the key of this edition and every April edition. What was the kind of key takeaway there? Well, I would say that the much feared recession that was supposed to happen as a result of the unprecedented, coordinated, I would say, increase in interest rates across the globe uh, did not materialize last year. There were some technical recessions here and there in Germany, in the Netherlands, in the UK, but nothing dramatic, nothing as severe as initially thought. In the US, there was a big discussion about soft landing, hard landing, and so on. Guess what? So far, we have no landing. So the US is actually doing pretty well. Its labor market is super robust. So effectively, the macroeconomic environment is, I would say, as stable as it can be, considering, first of all, the number of variables at play with the geopolitical variables, which we will discuss later on, but also considering the huge tightening in monetary policy that we have seen globally. So it couldn't be much worse. And in fact, is not. And there are no prospect for a massive further weakening of economic activity. Maybe not perfect, maybe not as rampant as we wish, but it's okay and it's stable. So, the first key takeaway is the macroeconomic environment is relatively stable.
And then looking to other areas, China seems to be potentially one that is, a cause for concern. What's going on here, and how much does it worry you?
Yeah, so China is a bit of a uh, country that needs to that requires some action. So clearly, there has been a successive reduction in its growth targets. Well, the 10, 12% growth rates of the even early 2000s with the room to go in the last century nowadays are kind of a far away memory. Um, we are now around what 5%,
Mhm.
5%. Communist Party realizes that as the economy grows, it cannot continue growing at 10% a year. These are the years in which you have an exponential growth. Here is the stabilization phase. They are reaching the frontier of what they can actually achieve. Is this the maximum? Well, Nouri Rubini has argued in his recent producing article. No, they risk remaining embroiled in what is called the middle income trap, the country that can reach a certain level of wealth and income, but it finds it hard to progress further and become a fully developed country, say, such as Korea in that area of the world, right? That start as an emerging market, but today we all consider it as a fully developed market. China actually risk facing what Richard Poole has called balance sheet recession, which means that over-indebtedness poses the need to repair those balance sheets. Nobody wants to borrow in the private sector, hence is the government that needs to borrow more. The government balance sheet explodes because they need to compensate for the lack of borrowing from private sector agents. And this is a long process. For Japan, it took 30 years, but now they seem to be finally back. Is China entering a similar phase? Richard Hu argues as such. We'll see whether that's the case or not.
And then secondly, I mean, inflation is one number sort of we've been watching very closely in various other podcasts since the beginning of this year. Where is inflation going, and how are major central banks reacting to it?
So inflation has been definitely moderating. The key point here is the labor market. So growth, okay, not spectacular apart from the US, but labor market much stronger than expected virtually everywhere. In Europe, in the US, to some extent even in Latam, and so on. Strong labor market means what? Typically means also wage growth. Wage growth comes with typically an acceleration of inflation. And we have seen some of these widespread spiral, as it is called, but not as much as it could have occurred, to the point that while the labor market remains strong in terms of job creation, wage growth is actually moderating. And with that, headline inflation is actually collapsed. So while not being as temporary as central bankers were hoping for at the beginning and actually required a huge tightening in monetary conditions, eventually inflation seems to be a monster that it has been tamed. Yes, there is the last bit from 3 to 2% in most countries, fine. It might be hard, but it shouldn't be too hard to eventually achieve. And if it's not achieved, central banks will deal with such a, on average, higher inflation rate. So they will not change the targets the euro, but they may change in de facto. So accepting slightly higher inflation rate, not massively higher, let's say between 2 and 4, which admittedly might be double the target, but from such a low level, nobody will ever die because inflation stays 3.5%. Might be uncomfortable in some quarters, clearly, but it's something people can live with. So central banks eventually will start cutting rates. Not exactly clear when and how, but there are indications. The ECB most likely in June, the Bank of England probably in August. The question is the Fed among the major central banks. It seemed that June was the time for first cut, but the reality is that they might need to wait a little bit longer, especially if growth remains so robust and the labor market is so strong. But again, we're talking about weeks now. It's not question months.
Yeah, I mean, also worth recalling how much this sort of landscape has changed from the start of the year when many people were predicting 5 to 6 rate cuts throughout the year. Now we're looking at the 3 to 4. But lastly, I mean, in spite of this sort of more tempered macro environment, geopolitical risk continues to abound. What are market participants most worried about in this area?
Yeah, that's the thing. So we titled the column of this week on which this podcast is based, macroeconomic stability and geopolitical risk, because these geopolitical risks continue to pose a threat to the continuation of this sort of Goldilocks scenario for macroeconomics. And you clearly, first that spring to mind, Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Hamas, the Houthis in the Red Sea. But, we have talked about plenty of other risks in our previous podcast. And the biggest of all is, of course, the US election, with the potential returning of Trump to the White House, which would probably change the entire macro and geopolitical and political risk environment. If we stay closer to home, these things are like these risks are likely to persist for a little bit longer. Russia will not stop its aggression until they know exactly who they are going to deal with in the White House, and they have an optional value waiting for a Trump re-election. Netanyahu, in theory, um, could be substituted, and that would probably give a totally different flavor to the current Israeli offensive in Gaza. But again, the mechanics of it is not obvious at all. So it takes time for this to happen. Uh, and um, and therefore these two very close to home, so to speak, risk environments will likely remain unchanged. And these may have eventually an impact on commodity prices, whether it's food from Ukraine or oil from the Middle East. We'll see.
And then, I mean, finally, of course, the 50th edition of the summer version of the Ambrosetti Forum will be happening later this year, perhaps another opportunity to take stock of some of these key themes that we discussed today at another important moment in a few months' time. So we'll look to that keenly. But as always, Brunello, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you. Until next time.